Chapter 2, in which Oscar is humiliated by a horrid old crone in a hotel foyer, before having his dinner interrupted by a retired doctor with only one eye and a penchant for ambiguity. The cat raised a withered paw and pointed with a shiny claw back toward the crowd outside. "I am she who ensures the likes of you never ever wins what you seek. Read well those letters, cat, for they are scrolled in irony." Oscar gawked. With a snarl she added, "That's right, you horrid little animal. You and your snotty kind will regret such resistance." She moved her pointy face closer. "Make no mistake, cat, the irony of such revenge." Oscar tried an apology, but it came out all squirty. "What did you say?" she hissed. He got up, having already forgotten. "How dare you?" she said, pushing at him. "How dare you even begin to address me?" I didn't mean—" "Oh, addressing me again, are you?" She slapped a paw across his face. "Perhaps that will teach you your place." He staggered backwards, a paw to his cheek, hemorrhaging disbelief. "One way or another," she hissed, "you will learn your place amongst us one way or another." Turning to her lackeys, she pulled her great coat tighter, posing like a model whose time had not only been, but was on pretty shaky ground even when present. She asked those around her, "Do you not think I am beautiful?" Oscar stifled a snort of laughter. He did not care for meanness, or animals considering themselves to be above others. He'd enough of this nasty old crone's theatrics, and was determined to return her to the litter box from whence she came. Bereft of entertainment, the audience milled back into the foyer. Amongst them, the dog with trendy sunglasses stopped to watch, delighted at further cabaret not mentioned in any of Rouen's holiday brochures. While the audience grew, Oscar put a paw to his whiskers in pretence and said, "I do not know who you are, madam, though you have made one thing abundantly clear." The old cat snarled, daring him to find reprisal. "That you are, without a doubt, the rudest, least tolerant animal it has ever been my misfortune to encounter, and I suggest you be a little more forgiving of others' shortcomings." He fluffed his pantaloons. "What's more, madam, I do not think you are beautiful. I'd be surprised if you ever were." With whiskers raised, he turned and strode away. The crowd, impressed by his eloquence, moved aside. But then came words that humiliated and hurt. The withered old crone, supported by a chuckle from her cabinet, said, "No doubt that is valid from an animal as ugly as you. Tell me, young cat, were you born with such a hideous head? Or was it a consequence of your mother having loved an owl?" Across the foyer, a shocked silence fell. Despite their sympathetic gaze, Oscar crumbled inside. The loud purr had been right. He was not a soldier. But how on earth could a velvet paw be anything else? Amidst amused congratulation from her minions, the old bag turned to leave. The audience stared at Oscar, hoping he might find some inspired retort to reclaim dignity. His indignation grew. He may not be a soldier, but he had eloquence. So he turned to her. "I haven't finished yet," he growled. "In fact, I haven't even started." The old cat halted and turned with a sneer. He continued, "Firstly, madam, I was not fortunate enough to know either of my parents, so I can't enlighten you on matters of paternalism. Secondly, I lost my ears only months ago, trying to save a cat from the clutches of the worst kind of villain." She was about to say something, but he held up a paw. "But I can assure you of one thing, you quite hideous old crone. The only thing that might find you beautiful is another corpse, which—" and he peered at her jostling pawns. "I see you have already surrounded yourself with liberally." The audience gave an impressed gasp. Confidence returning, he added, "And if I may hazard a guess as to who you might be, I'd find no position more credible than you being Miss Cantankerous Old Fart 1901, though I hasten to add that the title is unlikely, because she may still be alive to this day, And by the look of you, my dear, you died a terribly long time ago." A round of applause erupted from his audience, who moved forward to envelop him in congratulatory embrace, which rather closed the matter on the stunned animals opposite. Later that evening, Oscar sat at a table in Hotel Drouin's dining room. It was busy, vibrant, and full of wonderful smells and conversation. Cutlery chinked and drinks poured, and patrons smiled at him in recognition of his earlier rhetoric. Oscar wasn't comfortable with silver table service. It seemed ridiculous to have one animal subservient to another. Patrons convinced of their staged position above waiters, while waiters remained convinced that such roles were beneath them. It was all rather silly, and Oscar considered the world would be a far better place if they discarded such pretense and simply ate off the floor. In time, his meal arrived. It was fish, with a siding of crispy scales and a glass of chilled hot fin. He tasted the latter first. It was excellent. Tucking a napkin into his collar, he took a bite of crispy scale and found himself more content than he'd been for months.
"I too must congratulate you on your performance this morning."
Oscar looked up to see an old, austere and monocled dog, an animal who'd accompanied that horrid cat earlier. But his face was far from malicious. Indeed, he smiled. "Is that so?" Oscar said, returning to his meal.
"I assume you know who that cat was?"
After this morning's performance, indifference seemed prudent, so Oscar shrugged. "No, not at all," he said. "And frankly, I'm not terribly interested." The dog nodded.
"Nevertheless, there was no excuse for her behaviour, and I, at least, would like to apologise."
Having not expected civility, Oscar was relieved. Were a further altercation to erupt, he was unconvinced he'd find his prior fluency.
"I have suffered similar injury,"
the dog said, pointing at his monocle.
"The loss of an appendage is a hard thing to accept."
He reached into his coat and pulled out a card which he then offered.
"Should you wish to speak to an animal who has been through the same, you're more than welcome to call by."
"A doctor?" Oscar asked, looking up from the card.
"Once, a long time ago."
He pointed again to his affliction.
"Alas, this rendered my practice quite impossible."
"I'm sorry to hear that," Oscar said, looking back at the card, "and I accept your apology."
"Good.
He adjusted the monocle.
Young cat, Rouen is a delightful place to visit, but I urge you, in the light of this morning, to please be careful. Things in Rouen are not always as pleasant as they might appear."
Well, first impressions have been less than encouraging. The dog humphed in agreement. Being on Curiosa, the dog's words intrigued him, so Oscar introduced himself. In reply, the dog said his name was Horace Humpelhenke. Oscar pointed to a chair at his table. "Would you care to join me?" The dog hesitated, but then did so, and Oscar ordered 2 more chilled hot fins. "What do you mean by suggesting Rouen is not as pleasant as it might seem?" Oscar asked. The dog looked at him thoughtfully.
"I must say I'm intrigued by your earlier audacity, and by your having confronted the worst kind of villain."
Oscar waved a paw dismissively. "That was no more than words, Horace, a rhetoric necessary under the circumstances." The dog nodded.
"Of course, I understand."
But his thoughtfulness remained.
"Tell me, Oscar, what brings you to Rouen?"
After another sip of chilled hot fin, Oscar said, "Well, an aeroplane and curiosity, although not necessarily in that order." The dog smiled at such ambiguity.
"And the cat you challenged this morning, do you really have no idea who she is?"
Continuing his enthusiastic involvement with fish, Oscar shook his head.
"It was the Pyjami, Rouen's chief counsellor."
"Well, she's still jolly rude. One would think those in high places would be a little more tolerant of others, or courteous at least." Horace nodded and frowned.
"Tell me, Oscar, what sort of curiosities interest you?"
"Particularly curious ones," he said. dabbing his whiskers with a napkin and asking a passing waiter for 2 more chilled hot fins. I'm a cat. Curiosity is my thing.
I see, but why Rouen in particular? Surely there are far more curious places upon this earth than our quiet seaside city.
Well, you said it yourself. Things are not always as they appear. After a discreet burp, he added, and I cannot think of anything more curious than that. Horace smiled.
Yes, but I mentioned that only a moment ago. What gave you reason to imagine the same before arriving?
Why are things not as they appear? Oscar asked, wishing to return to the offensive. Horace took a deep breath, upsetting his monocle, which he dabbed at with a handkerchief.
Rouen is a city that has undergone immense change over recent years, Oscar. Change that has challenged her traditions. Unfortunately, Rouen is also a city uncomfortable with change.
Well, it would appear to me that Rouen has resisted change admirably.
To a degree, perhaps, but such defiance comes at a price.
But surely Rouen is wealthy enough to afford any price.
Oscar, the price to which I refer to is not monetary.
You mean a price of sufferance? The dog looked at him but did not reply. Are you telling me that something is brewing in Rouen? Oscar asked. Something that could mean trouble.
I am telling you nothing, young cat, other than to be careful after this morning's encounter.
Am I in some kind of danger?
I suspect that we are all in danger.
He stood then, having said enough, though added,
Traditions come and traditions go, my dear Oscar Teabag Duvin. They change and weave with tides of age and are far from being set in stone.
He shrugged.
I suspect some of us realize this more than others.
With that, and a respectful bow, he left, leaving Oscar confused and staring at 2 chilled hot fins getting warm. The following evening, after making about as much progress in Curiosa as a limp cabbage in a croquet competition, Oscar returned to Hotel Drouin to find police had cordoned the place off entirely, which was most disappointing. After such an unproductive day, he'd been looking forward to a repeat of last night's meal to compensate. Police cars blocked each end of the street and flashed importantly, while uniformed cats and dogs milled in and out of Hotel Drouin, escorting patrons from its vicinity. And although it looked like a bizarre crime scene bereft of any crime, it was only when a motorcade of black saloons with red plates pulled up at the hotel that Oscar realised why there were cordons at all. In a squeak of brakes, the cars stopped, doors opened, and from them spilled Rouen's ruling council. When Oscar spied Horace, he waved. While other councillors struggled from plush interiors, Horace shuffled over to Oscar, who remained behind a poorly constructed cordon of police animals. Their arrangement was far from protective, however, and instead resembled a badly rehearsed scene from What the Hell Are We Doing? The musical.
My dear Oscar Teabag Duvin,
Horace said, moving several police officers aside.
How delightful to see you again, although your scarf suggests you are perhaps dining elsewhere tonight.
Oscar nodded. Indeed, for it appears Hotel Drouin is this evening reserved exclusively for your exclusivity. And he looked past the dog to see whether the old crone had removed her saggy grey carcass from the motorcade. Regardless, I suspect my presence would not be conducive to a pleasant evening of dining. Horace smiled in understanding.
The Pajami is not with us this evening.
Oh?
We have a dinner celebrating the Council's 10th anniversary, but it appears we shall be doing so without the pleasure of her company. That is perhaps fortunate, as it will provide opportunity to discuss matters with my colleagues a little less formally. Not that it will make the slightest bit of difference.
Oscar tried similar elusiveness. What difference had you in mind? The dog looked at him carefully.
A rolling stone, young cat, gathers no moss.
Well, unless it's a sort of porous stone rolling through some very thick moss.
True.
And then it might gather quite a bit of moss, I should think, especially if it were early morning and the ground was all damp and dewy.
What I mean is sometimes when the wheels are in motion, things cannot be stopped.
Unless one uses brakes, Oscar said, or better still, a wall. There was an annoyed noise from one of the cars then, and both turned to watch a struggling counsellor get his walking stick caught in a police dog's trouser belt. Tell me, Horace, why are Rouen's counsellors all so terribly old? The dog humphed in amusement, both at Oscar's observation and the consequence of the belt breaking and trousers forming.
That, my dear cat, is entirely the problem.
Oscar looked at him. Problem? Horace's amusement faded when his colleague regained dignity and threw both of them a disapproving look.
Blood,
He said.
if left to grow old, becomes hard and black, and nothing can live on blood such as this. I am hopeful tonight might offer opportunity to find some resolve, with far less suspicion if she is absent.
He looked at Oscar then.
If you are visiting Rouen for curiosity alone, my young friend, then be terribly careful, for Rouen is on the brink of turning upside down, I am certain of it. If, however, you are here for reasons more subversive, then understand that in any battle, each army considers itself righteous.
And with that, he hurried to join those tottering up the hotel steps, leaving Oscar bewildered. Why can't animals just say what they mean? He wondered. He needed to think, and for that he required dinner, which was not going to be here. With a sigh, he tightened his smart blue scarf and fluffed his pantaloons. Turning, he then froze, astonished to see the dissenting cat from the other night staring at him. This time, Oscar broke the stalemate by yelling, "Hey!" at her. Flattening her ears, the derby hissed and spat before turning to scarp her through cordons, police and onlookers, leaving Oscar to stare after her, even more bewildered.